test.
Right. So maybe what we'll do, depending on how long Dr. Reesberg takes, if we're right up till lunchtime, I may just have everyone come back 15 minutes early to deal with that. But thanks for bringing that up, Ms. Weimiller, because I had forgotten. So feel free to remind me again if need be. All right. But for now, anything for the state then before we call for the jury? Let's bring the jury then in.
Okay, we'll go off the record and meet the WebEx. Off record, Joe, would you like me to go ahead? I can bring Dr. Reesberg up on the screen first, or?
No,
Okay.
not necessarily.
Okay, great. I will go ahead and grab the jury.
All right, please be seated. And before we start, I do want to thank the jury for its patience. I can tell you that as we get down to the end here, there may be a few other occasions where possibilities while we settle some legal issues. But with that, the defense next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The defense calls Daniel Reesberg. He'll be testifying by WebEx.
We'll bring him up on the screen.
This is the court clerk. Dr. Reesberg, could I have you go ahead and speak just a little bit so you come up on our active speaker view again? Oh, and you have muted yourself, so hold on. I will unmute you. Don't. Okay, you're unmuted now. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. This is still Dan Reesberg, and I'm still here.
And I'll have you just say another couple words because it's not quite caught you. Oh, there it is. Okay.
Okay.
We can see you now, Dr. Reesberg, so we'll have you raise your right hand and my clerk will give you an oath.
Okay. Under the penalty of perjury, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do swear.
Okay, thank you. You can put your hand down, and then because we're being recorded, I'll ask you to please state and spell your first and last name.
My name is Daniel Reesberg, and it's DanielReisberg.
All right, when defense is ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Reesberg.
Good morning.
We've got the screen on the opposite side of the courtroom from the camera, so we've got to juggle back and forth a bit. You have consulted with the defense in this case, have you not?
Yes, I have.
And did we arrange with you just this morning to actually testify in this matter?
That's right.
Tell the jury about you're now an emeritus professor at Reed College, is that correct?
That's right. I taught at Reed until 2019, and then I stepped back from teaching, so I'm now listed as emeritus.
All right. Tell us how you got to that point, what your education is, and what you've done over the course of your career.
Sure. I have a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and PhD. They're all in psychology. The master's and PhD are in what's called experimental psychology, which simply signals that I'm trained in the scientific research end of the field. And so, just to be clear, I'm not a mental health professional. I don't do diagnosis. I don't do therapy. I'm trained as a scientist. My PhD is from the University of Pennsylvania in 1980. And since then, so, in the 40 plus years since then, I've been working as a member of the scientific community, doing research, publishing, teaching, also doing some amount of consulting. Mostly with a focus on a list of scientific questions concerned with how does memory operate? What is the biology underlying memory? How accurately can people remember? What's the best way to find out what someone remembers? A variety of questions, but all centered on the central issue that has pretty much defined my professional life, which is the study of memory.
All right. So you indicated that you don't actually see patients. Have you ever had a clinical practice?
No, I'm not trained as a mental health professional. My training is in research methods, statistics. I have a laboratory, not a practice.
All right. And can you tell us a little bit about that training? How does one become trained, or what's the background that gives you that platform to then do this research and explore the science?
Some of the training is, of course, formal. Any scientist has to take the relevant courses in research methods, statistics, and then another course in statistics, and then another course in statistics. But then beyond that, the way science works is, one jumps in and starts doing studies. Crucially, an important part of the scientific process is that you have to take whatever studies you've done, or whatever papers you've written, whatever views you've articulated, and put them out in plain view. And scientists then are not at all shy about giving you feedback, including critical feedback if it's relevant. And in that fashion, in sort of an ongoing conversation with each scientist putting their views into writing, getting feedback from their peers, that's the way scientists develop their knowledge base, develop their skills.
You spent most of your career at Reed, is that correct?
Yeah, I was at Reed for about 30 some odd years.
All right. You have a very, very long CV, and I don't want you to take the time to go through all of it, but can you give us some sense of how often you've been published over the course of your career?
Well, I mean, I think the total count of publications has not yet broken 100. It's getting pretty close. That's a mix of research papers in academic journals. There's also a number of chapters that I've contributed to books that were being put together by one or another colleague. I've also edited a number of books so that I was the choreographer putting chapters together from various authors. And then I also have written a number of books over the years.
Okay, and does that also include papers that you presented at scientific meetings?
Well, no, in addition to, the 80 or 90 papers that I've published, whatever the count currently is, I've also participated in a number of scientific meetings, or at least I used to in the days before COVID. And scientific meetings are, just an opportunity to get caught up on what kinds of data are so new that they're not yet out in print. It's also a great opportunity to get feedback from your colleagues about things that you might have said that are mistaken, things that you might have said that are incomplete. I mean, it's part of the process of scientific communication that, in essence, overall provides the quality control that is central to the sciences.
All right. And can you just tell us briefly about honors and awards, how your peers have recognized you over the course of your career?
Sure. I mean, I guess, the one award that I'm particularly proud of was that, in the last years at Reed, Reed honored me by moving me into an endowed chair. So I now have a very fancy title, signaling the fact that I was promoted to an endowed chair. In addition, my colleagues have over the years recognized me, on a number of occasions, and usually that takes the form of, what is really a vote of confidence, a vote of applause, which takes the form of you being elevated to the category of fellow in this or that academic society. And so I'm a fellow of the Psychonomic Society, a fellow of the American Psychological Association, a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science, a fellow of the British Psychological Society, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and on. You get the idea.
I do. And most of this relates to the work that you've done in the field of memory, I take it.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. All right. Now, memory is probably almost as varied as the human mind, I would imagine. I want to focus you today on the concept of traumatic memory and how the brain responds to traumatic shock. You have not had occasion to follow all of this trial, have you?
No, I've not been following the trial at all.
Okay, and our client testified earlier this week. Were you able to watch that?
No, I did not.
Okay, so the information that you're going to be provided today, it will be sort of a recap or a hypothetical based on what's occurred in this trial. But we're asking you to apply what you know about memory, what you know about the science. We're not asking you for some particular evaluation of her because, of course, you didn't watch her testimony and you've not been in a position to make a case-specific or person-specific evaluation, okay?
Certainly.
Okay, so what the testimony that she gave essentially revolves around, well, it was long and varied and we covered many topics, but as it relates to memory.
Your Honor, I have a matter. I would object to the question. This expert doesn't appear to have any knowledge about anything that's happened.
All right, let me have the jury step out for just a minute.
What was her?
So, Ms. Weinmiller, as I understand it, this witness hasn't followed the case, doesn't know the specific facts of the case. I certainly have no issue with you asking him generalized questions about how trauma might affect memory, but I'm not going to allow you to essentially testify again for your client by repeating your summary of what you think she said. The jury's heard what she said. They can use their own memories on that. What is it? Because I got the sense too that you were about to essentially summarize your client's testimony and ask if it makes sense. I'm not going to allow that. I will allow you to ask him questions that derive from her testimony, such as, if you want to ask him how trauma can impact memory, or if memory can come in, flashes, or however you want to word it, but I don't want you to provide him a recitation of the evidence that's come in the case. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does, of course, Your Honor. And I guess I could go about this two ways. I could either phrase it as a hypothetical, which I was about to get into doing, or I could just ask him questions without even giving him any of the facts. But what I wanted to do is at least get him oriented to the particular area of memory so that we're not getting a lot of information that's not particularly pertinent to the analysis I think that the jury ultimately will have to apply.
Give me an example. Like, what was the question about to be?
Well, I could ask him whether if a person has experienced an extreme traumatic shock, has just lost a spouse, has just learned of that, and then is questioned about that, how memory responds in an instance like that, what the brain actually does, what the chemical process is in response to that shock, and then from there how that develops, what's happening with the formation of memory and the ability later to recall. So I can do that without making any reference at all to anything other than extreme traumatic shock, but I do want to frame it at least in terms that makes it clear that we're talking about a really extreme shock,
Sure.
right? One of those
Well,
sort of
let me
once in a
first
lifetime
see
events.
if there's even an objection to that question.
No, not at all.
All
I think
right,
that's
so,
allowed.
okay, so you can ask the question as you worded it, Ms. Weinmiller, and just so I want to be clear too, you can ask hypothetical questions. I'm not trying to limit that. I think the state was concerned, and frankly, I was too, that perhaps it was going to be a recitation of specific things she said. But as far as if you want to identify, we're talking about, because there are all sorts of different traumas, I would imagine. So if you're wanting to give the hypothetical of the traumatic loss of a spouse, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay, all right. Let's bring the jury back in.
Off record and mute the WebEx.
All right, please be seated. Based on the question, as we now understand it to be, the objection was withdrawn. Go ahead, Ms. Weinberg.
Dr. Riesberg, let me back up a couple of steps. I'd like to orient you particularly to a particular area of memory and functioning of the human brain, and that is an incident where a person experiences what could be considered a once-in-a-lifetime shock, an extreme traumatic event that is unexpected and something that the person does upon taking in this information understands will be life-changing, will just fundamentally disrupt their life as they had planned to live it. In that circumstance, I would imagine that the research shows, and we'd like you to tell us about this, is there a wide variety of reactions that people have when they experience that kind of extreme once-in-a-lifetime trauma?
I mean, the answer is it really depends on just how extreme the traumatic response is. And, there's going to be a large difference from one person to the next in how they react to trauma. I don't know if you want the biological details, but, people differ in how quick and how extreme their cortisol response is, so that there's just biological differences from one person to another in how they react to extreme stress. And that turns out to be crucial because, for moderate and even high levels of trauma and stress, those episodes are obviously horrible to go through something traumatic, but at the same time, those episodes have a positive effect on memory. And so somebody who goes through a traumatic event tends to have a clear, long-lasting memory of the core of the event for a very long time, but is likely to have little or no memory for other aspects of the event. That's true up to a point. The reason I want to be fussy about that is if the trauma or the stress is too severe for that individual, then you get a completely different outcome, because at that point, in essence, what the body does is make a series of adjustments that are in the evolutionary past of our species, designed to help you deal with a truly extreme emergency. And those adjustments, among other things, basically take resources away from parts of the body that are not needed at that second to cope with the emergency, in order to funnel all of the resources into basically survival. And with that platform, what I can say is, at that very high level of stress, the biological processes needed for the process known as memory consolidation simply does not happen. And so in that setting, rather than getting a better memory, which is what you get from a lower level of stress, what you get is no memory at all. And in fact, you get a pattern that is referred to as a retrograde amnesia. We can unpack that term if you like, but basically the person is very likely to lose any memory at all for what happened in the minutes or even hours, or even many hours prior to the stress. Because the biological processes that are needed to basically cement those memories in place get disrupted because the body is sending resources elsewhere.
I would like to unpack that a little bit. So you said that sometimes in moments of extreme stress, and now we're talking about incidents that are unanticipated, right? Now, obviously,
Yes.
It can be very traumatic to lose somebody that you care about very much, but if they have passed away from Alzheimer's or some sort of progressive lingering disease, it's a different kind of stress than we're talking about now, correct?
Sure.
Okay, so this is an unanticipated and also extreme stress.
That's right. Think about it as, the person's brain, the person's body has registered that this is truly an emergency. And so this is not the time to digest. This is not the time to admire the scenery. This is the time to direct all of your resources into just getting through the next minutes. That's the kind of extreme stress at which you start getting the pattern of retrograde amnesia.
Okay, and you described part of that phenomenon as a focus that can bring great clarity to a certain part of that event. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, but that's going to be what happens at essentially a lower level of stress. When you get to the truly emergency extreme, then basically all of the memory operations are put on hold, just as digestion is put on hold. I mean, it's a case in which, basically the body's resources really are focused very narrowly for purposes of survival.
All right. All right. So we're in a moment of getting news that a catastrophic, a horribly traumatic extreme event has occurred. Where would the focus go? Where, let's say there's a period of hours, but the news arrives at a certain moment. Where would that focus tend to go? What do we know? What does the science tell us about that narrowing of focus?
Well, I guess I need to give you an answer in two parts. What your focus is very likely to be on is the immediate source of the threat, the immediate source of the stress. And so if someone is bringing you horrible news, it's quite plausible that your focus would be on that news, or maybe, if the news is about someone you love, something that you care deeply about, your focus could easily be on them. But the key is going to be, your question asked about where within those hours. The important thing to keep track of here is that because of that emergency response from the body, you're going to lose all memory for things that, again, happened in the minutes or hours leading up to that stress. And that is, by definition, retrograde amnesia. Amnesia in general refers to any kind of memory loss. Retrograde amnesia refers to a memory loss that extends backwards in time for the events prior to the episode that launched the amnesia.
Right. So what's the actual physical chemical process that causes that to happen? Can you just break down what's happening in the brain at that point?
Certainly. Whenever you encounter an event, for example, you're listening to my words right now, the meaning of those words is immediately registered in the brain, I hope. And what makes that possible is that the brain can change its pattern of electrical activity very quickly. And so the minute I give you some new information, imagine I tell you my favorite color is forest green. The minute you have that information, your brain can make electrical adjustments that register the fact that, Dan Riesberg likes forest green. The key, though, is that if I now move on to some other topic, your brain is again going to make electrical adjustments, which means that you're going to lose that storage that you had a moment ago for my favorite color. And in light of that pattern, what you need is really two very different memory mechanisms. You need a pattern of fast adjustments in electrical activity that have the huge advantage of being fast, so they can happen immediately, but they also have the problem of being fragile. And those sit alongside of a different set of processes, which are exactly the opposite. They are slowly produced, but then they're much longer lasting. And the process through which a memory moves from that fast electrical pattern into the more enduring pattern is what's referred to as memory consolidation. And memory consolidation is rather slow. Depending on exactly how you measure it, it can, be detected as a process that stretches out over 6, 8, 10, 12 hours. In some circumstances, it may be even slower. And what memory consolidation does is quite literally rewire the brain. If you want the nuts and bolts, what you were doing is, generating new proteins in order to build new structures called dendritic spines. I don't know if we need all of the details, but basically you are creating new patterns of connection from one nerve cell to the next, from one neuron to the next. And because it's a structural change, it's not dependent on moment-by-moment activity, and therefore it's going to be long-lasting. And now that we've got those basics in view, what extreme stress does is just change the biochemical environment inside the body so that the consolidation process does not take place. And so the memories never reach any sort of enduring form. And so they're just not there. It's, a friend of mine likes to put it poetically that the seeds of memory are washed from the soil before they have a chance to take root. And, it's a little bit poetic, but it gets the idea right, because the memories are not ever put into enduring solid form, with the result that later on there is no memory. And if you go looking for it, there's nothing there, because the memory was never put into that enduring form. And so, among other implications, there's certainly no prospect of recovering that memory later, because there's nothing to recover. The memory was never established in the first place. So sorry about the long answer, but that's
that was helpful.
That's the process.
So, and does the body work at night during sleep to consolidate memories? Is sleep important to memory consolidation?
Yes, in fact, memory consolidation overall just works in the background. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to work at it. It just happens as long as you stay healthy. And the evidence is quickly accumulating that consolidation is, especially likely when you're asleep. There's some debate over which of the sleep stages is particularly important for consolidation, but there's no question that consolidation goes forward more effectively after 8 or 9 hours asleep compared to the same 8 or 9 hours awake. So sleep does contribute to consolidation.
All right. So let me give you a hypothetical. If somebody woke up in sometime around 6 in the morning, little after 6, and then experienced one of these really extreme traumatic shocks sometime mid-morning, well before noon, what do we know about how that memory formation could go between, let's say, the hours of 6 and 12? Let's say, just for sake of argument, let's say the shock occurs, or at least begins, the kind of dawning realization of the shock occurs sometime around 10 a.m. What would you expect in terms of how memory of those preceding hours, let's say, first of all, working back from 10 o'clock, might work? What has the science shown about that, and what are the limitations on what we know so far about that?
The pattern that has been identified for probably about 120 years or so. The pattern was early on described by a French psychologist named Ribot, which, just so you know, this is, spell it like robot, but replace the first O with an I, and now you have Ribot. Ribot documented the pattern. It's now routinely referred to as Ribot's law. And the pattern of Ribot's law is, if the shock, I'm going to follow your hypothetical, happened at 10 in the morning, then the memories you're most likely to lose, the memories for which you are most likely to have retrograde amnesia, will be the ones between 9:30 and 10, sort of the half hour before the shock. The half hour before that, you're probably going to lose the memories, but not quite as guaranteed. The half hour before that, the likelihood of losing the memories goes down a little bit. And basically, the further back in time the memories, the further back in time the events, the less likely you are to lose them. And so the retrograde amnesia will be most likely and most severe for the immediate lead up to the shock, and then it will sort of gradually taper off. And, in terms of consolidation, what's going on there, Ribot didn't know this, but now, 100 plus years later, we do know it, is that for the events just before, let's say, a 10 a.m. shock, the consolidation has barely started, may not even have started. And so those memories are highly vulnerable. For events, say, an hour before that, the consolidation has sort of started, and so you have a chance of holding on to those memories. For events 3 and 4 hours back, the consolidation has gotten decently underway, and so you've got a slightly better chance of holding on to those memories. And so, it's the fact that the consolidation process is stretched out across hours and just gets better and better as time goes by is what leads to the pattern that, like I said, for a century we've called Ribot's law.
Okay. And would the expectation be that because the person had slept and memories had been consolidated, that that the moment of waking would be sort of the furthest back that memory loss might go? Or are there instances that have been seen by scientists where actually the retrograde amnesia is stretched back, into the preceding days for a much longer period of time?
Certainly one can find retrograde amnesia that reaches further back in time. But again, Ribot's law is going to be the description of most of the pattern, and I emphasize most. We may need to circle back for, the complication in Ribot's law. But, the further back in time, the less likely it is that you're going to lose the memory when the horrible shock, the horrible trauma arrives.
All right, and this is where statistics come in handy, right?
Among other places.
So, with respect to this period of time earlier where there's been at least the potential that the memories have begun to form, that they've begun to consolidate, that process is by no means complete, but there's at least been the inkling of it. How does that work? Are those usually intact memories? Are they fragmented memories? What do we know about what happens for that period where it's a little bit more spotty?
Well, spotty is a good word to use here because, as I signaled a moment ago, even though Ribot's law is well established, clear, easy to see in both human data and, for that matter, a variety of animal studies, there's a complexity, which is it is fairly common for us to observe what's often referred to as islands of preserved memory. And from the science I've seen, from the science I read, it's not 100% clear why particular bits are spared the memory loss. The most obvious account that I've seen suggests that what's going on is that, the brain is just, in essence, more prepared for some events, perhaps because it's an event that happened all the time, or perhaps it's an event that was immediately and deeply meaningful for you. But, whatever the reasons, one does expect to see sort of superimposed on the pattern of Ribot's law, one tends to see an island here, an island there of memory that seems not to be wiped out by the retrograde amnesia. And again, I think the science is just not yet clear on predicting when those islands will occur and what exactly will be contained within those islands that are somehow, spared the memory loss.
And when you use that phrase, islands in time, it sounds like you're talking, islands of preserved memory, it sounds like you're talking about islands in time. And by that, I mean, they're isolated incidents and they're not all contiguous to each other. And I think what you're saying is there's not an absolute relationship between the time that's passed and the integrity of this island of memory.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Okay. And you said there's no good scientific explanation for it, but you also suggested that there's at least some theorizing and some study that's being done now that certain things could impact what makes an island of memory form, which of those little spots of memory end up being cohesive, potentially accurate memories, and which just don't form at all. Can you talk about that a little bit more? What's thought?
Sure. It's
impact that.
There's certainly some very obvious hypotheses, and the hypotheses start with the fact that, because of the experiences that we bring into a situation, because of the expectations that we bring into a situation, some aspects are very quickly understood, very quickly tied in with other things that we know, other elements that are already established in our memory. So in essence, we have, things to hook the new information onto, or a framework that immediately allows us to grasp the new information and tie it in with other things. Those kinds of considerations are important for memory across the board. And so you will have an easier time remembering something if it's particularly meaningful to you. You'll have an easier time remembering something if you can immediately fit it into some sort of framework or scheme. I mean, that's just true as a operating principle of memory across the board. And it seems highly likely that it's pretty much the same principles that will, in essence, allow you to consolidate those little bits of information more quickly. And so if at some point 5 hours, 8 hours, 3 hours down the road, you experience a blow to the head, or if you suffer a horrible emotional trauma, those things may be just further along in their consolidation because you were receptive to them when they arrived.
Now, if it's known, can you tell us whether the things that form these islands of memory, are those things that are thought to, that they would have created a stronger memory over the long term had the traumatic shock never occurred? Is that process that you're describing the same thing that makes some of our memories really brilliant even years later? You have a very distinctive memory of an event when you, of course, years later wouldn't remember, be able to say what you did the rest of that day. Is there a relationship there?
I mean, that's right. And, indeed, if I can sort of turn that around, that's the foundation for the hypothesis, right? I mean, we know that some things are quickly established in memory, easily established in memory, because you immediately understand them, you immediately can fit them into a frame. Like I said, that's just true across the board for memory. It's one of the reasons why, just as an example, if you give me some new bit of information about a new research paper in memory, I'm going to quickly understand it because I bring a lot of background to it, and that's going to make it easy for me to understand a new paper. It's going to make it easier for me to remember that new paper. If you brought me some new paper in, macroeconomics, I wouldn't be able to make much sense of it because it's not my field, and so I'd have a harder time remembering it. Those kinds of things are true independent of trauma, stress, emotions of any sort. And it's, because we know that things differ in terms of how readily remembered they are. And again, the key principle is typically, what knowledge, what framework do you bring into the situation? Because we know that's true overall, that makes it highly likely that that's going to allow those kinds of events to be more rapidly, more efficiently consolidated so that they're going to be less damaged if the consolidation is somehow thrown off track.
All right. Now, to make this hypothetical a little bit more complicated, if the person who is about to experience this traumatic memory is engaged in a process where they're very absorbed in a creative process, they're thinking about something else, it has their full attention, and they are, able to function, able to move around, but they're really not, taking in the world as a whole. They've got a very specific thing that their brain's working on. Let's leave traumatic memory out of this for a moment. Can you just describe what happens with the brain, like, with artists? Let's use artists as an example in the creative process. When people talk about people getting lost in that, what does that actually mean? What happens?
Sure. And, what's in play here, I assume applies to artists. It applies pretty much to anyone. So far we've been talking about the biological events that take place in the hours after you have some experience. That's when the consolidation happens, sort of in the background of your thoughts. We need to shift emphasis by a lot if we're talking about what is happening during the experience itself, not in the hours afterward, but during the experience. And for that, the science could not be clearer. In order to get information into your memory, you need to pay attention to it. You need to engage it in some way. And things, the demonstration that's routinely in place in many research studies is that if something has been in front of your eyes over and over and over again, but you just have no reason to pay attention to it, no reason to think about it, then that information basically does not get into your memory because you didn't do the kind of mental work that it takes to get something established. And there's many sort of common sense versions of that. I think the version that pretty much we've all experienced at one point or another, is, the experience of you're driving down I-5, your thoughts are wandering to, whatever's coming up in your day, or maybe your thoughts are wandering to what happened yesterday, and you suddenly realize that you don't have a clue what happened for the last 30 miles. You obviously were awake, you were conscious, you were managing to drive your car without, driving into a ditch. But because you were thinking about, basically stuff inside your head, memories, anticipations, wanderings, you were not paying attention to your surroundings. And if I quiz you on, did you go by exit 243? Did you see that particular billboard? You're going to be clueless because that information didn't get into your head because you weren't paying attention to it. And so what you now have is, we're marching our way toward, what's a pretty complete theory of memory. In order to get information into memory in the first place, you need to pay attention to it during the event. It helps enormously if you've got background and expectations that allows you very quickly to see the meaning of that material. And then once the experience is over, what you really need to do is basically stay healthy so that the consolidation can take place. And that fast description pretty much captures a lot of scientific evidence for how memory gets established.
So I'd like to talk now a little bit about how if at all, that can be fixed. There's this gap that's been caused by this traumatic event and this focus, this person naturally being intent on survival and trying to figure out going forward what they need to do. But this deficit, this retrograde amnesia that's now occurred, how, if at all, can that memory be reconstructed? What happens there? What does the brain do to fill that in?
Okay, the answer is going to have a couple of parts. Let's first talk about what's not going to happen. If the consolidation process was disrupted, if the consolidation process didn't reach completion, then the memory was never established. And if you go looking for it later, it's not there. And so if you claim later on your memory will somehow get better, that's fiction. Because it's, if the memory was not recorded, if there's nothing on a computer disk and you hit play, you're not going to get anything. If there's nothing written on a page and you try to read it, there's nothing there to read. And that's basically the situation with disrupted or interrupted consolidation. Nonetheless, people routinely do what they can to figure out what happened in the past. And in fact, a large part of what we call remembering is a mixing of things that you genuinely remember with things that you infer, things that you suppose, and sometimes people are aware of it. People will say things like, as best as I can recall, or I guess what must have happened is blah, blah, blah. People use those words, but in many cases, people think they're remembering when in fact what their brain is supplying for them is some sort of general knowledge based on your expectations for the world, your knowledge about how the world works, and often those inferences masquerade as memories and feel like genuine memories, even though in fact they're really just inferences and reconstructions.
And has psychology been able to determine whether that's a phenomenon that happens across the board, or whether there are certain types of people that are particularly it sounds like what you're saying is that the brain abhors a vacuum, that there's a natural process of trying to fill that in, right? That it doesn't feel right to say there's nothing there. And that somehow, without perhaps even conscious thought, there's a reconstructive process that's occurring. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm not sure about the brain abhorring a vacuum. I think one of the important things to keep track of here is that, for the most part, our memories are terrific. But what you've got to be alert to is what job they're terrific at. Our brains are terrific at basically building knowledge. And as we go through life, we pick up a bit of information here, a bit of information there. Later on, we figure out something for ourselves. 3 days later, we realize part of what we heard the first time was wrong, so we have to fix it. And our memories are fabulous at weaving together all of those various pieces, and that's why people know so much about so many things. The problem is that weaving together process is so automatic, so efficient, so continuously ongoing that people often lose track of where they got a particular piece of information from, and among other things, they lose track of whether something is genuinely being remembered from an original experience or whether it's an after-the-fact fill-in of some sort. And again, if you really want to know minute by minute what people experienced, if you're looking to be a historian, this is a real problem for you. But I mean, it's not a defect in our memories. It's just a reflection of the fact that our memories are set up in a wonderful way to accumulate and build knowledge. And the price we pay for that is often losing track of where this or that bit of information came from, including what's a real memory versus what's a reconstruction.
So is it fair to say that the brain's job, essentially, its evolutionary purpose, is a constructive one, that it is constantly trying to construct knowledge, trying to construct memories, trying to build on what it knows?
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially right. That's right.
So when you've got an instance of this interrupted consolidation, it hasn't occurred, the memory has not formed, or if it's formed in a very piecemeal way. And is there a better term than piecemeal? How do you, we talked about islands of memory, but are the,
I mean, like I said, the common terminology is the combination of Freebo's law as the overarching pattern and then the preserved islands. I mean, that's just the standard way these things are talked about.
Okay. All right. So if you're in a situation like that where there is not a cohesive, complete memory, there are islands of memory, you've talked about what the brain would naturally do, but do scientists, do clinical psychologists, do people have, has there been an approach developed that could accurately help complete that memory again?
I'm not quite sure what you mean. Certainly there have been, many efforts over the years to help people to remember, including, exotic things like, hypnosis and, various drugs that have been used. I mean, the bottom line is those things don't work. They seem not to produce an improvement in memory. I mean, in essence, what's gone is gone. And if there's a reconstruction that's sort of been welded on top of, whatever other information you have, it's now, completely integrated with the memory. And it's now genuinely what you believe happened in the past. And, if you, yell at people, be careful when you remember, if you offer cash awards to people for being accurate, if you advise people only to give you their answers if they're totally sure, all of those things basically leave in place the blunt fact that our memories tend to weave together information from different sources.
Okay. So if a person who has experienced a traumatic memory, or this trauma-induced amnesia, the retrograde amnesia, that person is then shown photographs of themselves doing something or photos that appear to depict them doing something, can that person develop a true memory of that event?
It is certainly true that in a number of research studies, people have been exposed to outside influences that have led them to, absorb this new information in a way that leads them to a memory that is systematically less accurate. And there's a number of studies that, make it pretty clear that if we show you something that is, offered as evidence, this is the way the past unfolded, that is a particularly powerful way to shape what someone's remembering, because they are, in essence, absorbing the information provided by the photograph or whatever the image is. and that simply gets woven into their recollection and will change how they currently believe the past to have been, and can, in some circumstances, lead to memories that are systematically less accurate.
All right. And you made some reference just now to studies. Have you yourself done some work in this area?
I mean, I certainly have, collected data on these points. I think more broadly, I have been writing about these issues, teaching about these issues, consulting about these issues, for the last 30, 40 years.
Right. And have you published any work in this area?
Yes, I have.
Are you currently in the process of working on a paper or about to publish a paper relevant?
Actually, I mean, my research partner, Kathy Pesek, and I just, finished working on a paper. That paper is now through the peer review process. It's officially coming out, and talks about a variety of issues of perception and memory. So yeah, that's the most recent, I think, pair of things that I've written, because there's a paper that is, like I said, through the peer review process. It's in press, and then there's essentially a postscript that is also through the peer review process and about to come out.
Right. So if, in this hypothetical that we were just discussing, if the person had experienced this retrograde amnesia, had this extreme traumatic event, it did not remember more than just islands of memory, but then had a great deal of information brought to them, including photographs that purported to depict them doing something, what would the science tell us about how reliable and how accurate those memories ended up being after that introduction of all this new material?
I mean, I guess I want to separate reliability from accuracy. I mean, it's certainly quite possible that the person could be led by these photographs, could be led by other information to engage in a process of reconstruction. And because it's reconstruction and not memory, there's always a chance that the reconstruction is mistaken. And on that basis, I would be worried about whether you've got a reliable memory, but it's also possible that the reconstruction gets things right? I mean, it's, I guess, if I can use a folksy example, it's like, the drunk who wakes up with little or no memory for how he got home the night before, but says, gee, here I am in my bed and my car's in the driveway. I guess I must have driven home. That's plainly a reconstruction and could be wrong, but it's also possible he's got it quite right. And so, reconstructions can sometimes be accurate, but they're still reconstructions and therefore can sometimes be inaccurate.
And is there a tool that's been developed to tell the difference between those two?
Researchers have poured lots of energy into trying to ascertain when somebody's memory is truly reflecting history and when it's off track. And I mean, I can walk through the details if you like, but as far as we can know, in the vast majority of circumstances, there is no reliable indicator that will tell us for a particular memory, this is one of the accurate ones, or this is not. We've looked at, somebody's level of certainty when they report the memory. We've looked at somebody's level of emotion when they recall the memory. We've looked at the level of detail when they recall the memory. And there's statistical effects, but the data are messy enough so that the bottom line is, so far we have discovered no reliable indicator that will let us tell whether somebody's memory is mistaken.
All right. Thank you. I've got no further questions right now.
All right, cross-examination.
Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Reesberg.
Good morning.
Dr. Reesberg, your primary occupation is now as a retired professor of psychology. Is that correct?
And mostly what I'm working on is, writing projects. I'm, a textbook author. That's what fills most of my days.
And you have a side consulting business for criminal cases?
I'm not sure I want to count it as a business. It was never work I went looking for, but yeah, I mean, I do amount of consulting and, I do get paid for it. I guess you can therefore call it a business.
In fact, do you regularly make over $100,000 a year on criminal cases testifying as an expert?
In many years, yeah, I do make over $100,000.
Including the last several years, with some exception, I am sure, with the pandemic.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And you've worked in a university setting as a professor since getting your PhD in 1980.
That's right.
You do not practice as a psychologist, correct?
I mean, if you mean, do I practice as a mental health professional? I hope I was clear on that before. It's a different branch of psychology. It's completely separate from what I do.
Right. And in fact, you can't represent yourself as a psychologist because you're not licensed.
No, that's false. I can't represent myself as licensed because I'm not, but I am certainly a psychologist. There are different types of psychologists. There are mental health professionals. Those are the folks who are licensed. And then psychologists like me who are trained as scientists. They're all called psychologists.
All right. But you have no experience interviewing anyone in any sort of forensic setting, correct?
That's right.
And
That's right.
You've never had any active practice or seen patients in any capacity.
Again, I'm not a mental health professional. I'm trained as a researcher.
And generally speaking, you testify regarding eyewitness identification, photo lineups, suggestiveness of out-of-court identification procedures, child memories, particularly in the nature of child sexual assault cases. Is that correct?
Those are all topics I've worked on. They're all topics that hinge on evidence that's coming out of somebody's memory.
And Dr. Reesberg, did I understand correctly you were retained by defense this morning?
I mean, I have had occasional conversations with defense across the last many weeks. My understanding until early this morning was that I was not going to be testifying in this trial. I learned this morning that I was testifying. So I'm not sure at what point I count as retained, but that's the history.
Sure. And fair to say that then once you learned you were testifying, you provided documentation and some articles just before 8 a.m. that were provided to the parties this morning?
That's right.
And how much are you being paid for your testimony today?
I don't have a clue. I don't think we've ever discussed it. I assume I'll need to work that out with the defense team.
What's your normal hourly rate?
I'm not sure I have a normal hourly rate for cases that are being paid specifically by the defendant. My rate varies. I mean, I like making money, but I have no interest in vacuuming out somebody's pockets. I've worked for free on a number of cases, and once charged $30 to a guy who laid linoleum for a living. He earned $30 an hour, so that's what I charged him. So yeah, it varies.
All right. And how often in your consultation on legal cases are you retained by criminal defense attorneys?
I mean, I am, brought issues to examine by attorneys of all sorts, probably, 3 or 4 times a week, every week, well over 200 cases a year, needing, looking, inviting my examination in some regards.
All right. You've never testified for the state in any case, is that correct?
That's right, for a very simple reason.
Well, and as part of that, when the state contacts you to ask you about the scope of your testimony, it's regularly your practice to refuse to speak to the state unless defense gives you permission, correct?
No, that's certainly false. I mean, when a prosecutor calls me, as I was called in this case, I make it very clear that I'm happy to talk with them, ready to talk with them, but feel that just as a professional courtesy, I should, check in with the attorneys who retained me to find out what their wishes are, and then, I follow their wishes.
In other words, you get permission from them before you're willing to speak with the state.
I mean, I find out what their wishes are. If you want to call that permission, yeah, I guess that's true.
And in the past, you've referred to that practice as stonewalling in an email regarding the state, correct?
Boy, I made that joke in an email, was it 3 or 4 years ago? And your office is having a hard time getting over that joke. Yeah, I did make that joke some years ago.
And Dr. Reesberg, you would agree that when you are testifying in a case like this one, or in any case, that you consider yourself a witness, you're imparting information?
I mean, I can't imagine what you're asking. I mean, am I a witness in this case? Yes, I'm testifying as an expert witness.
And you'd agree that it's important to be neutral when you present information in a criminal court?
I try to be.
And you'd agree that it's for the jury to decide the facts in the case?
Absolutely, yes.
And would you agree that you'd be opposed to being an advocate as an expert witness on a case that you're testifying on?
I certainly try to avoid taking any sort of advocacy position.
And you wouldn't consider yourself an advocate on this case, would you?
Not in any way I can see.
And if we did have experts taking the stand as advocates, that would potentially risk misleading the jury about information that they portray. Wouldn't you agree?
I guess, much depends here on what you imagine as an advocate, but certainly if a expert is giving misinformation or partial information, that would be very troubling.
And that was going to be my next question exactly. So specifically, if an expert is providing, focusing on a very small problem or ignoring context of other pieces of information or other aspects of, studies or, other work that may be relevant to their field, that would be misleading. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, if the expert knows of other information and is choosing to ignore it, that would be a problem.
And Dr. Reesberg, you would agree that, and I think you said this, that memories are actually quite good?
In general, I'm clear on this in many things I've written. I've been clear on this in testimony. Our memories are accurate far more often than they're inaccurate. They're correct far more often than they're wrong.
And would you also agree that overall, most traumatic events are well remembered for many years?
I certainly would agree that. I've written that. I suspect the book you're about to read from is a book written by me that contains almost exactly that sentence.
Right. And would you also agree that many studies indicate that people's memories can be heightened during an emotional event?
I'm not sure what you mean by heightened, but as I testified earlier, in general, emotional events and even traumatic events have a positive impact on memory, although a selective impact. You tend to remember the core and not much more. That's what you get if the person is, stressed, aroused, traumatized, but not at a high enough level to produce the retrograde amnesia we were discussing earlier.
And you've stated previously in your written work that a delay in reporting a traumatic event may improve memory, but may also compromise memory. And therefore, observations that a witness was under stress doesn't really move the ball forward or backwards in terms of evaluating the accuracy of their statement. Wouldn't you agree?
I'm not quite sure in what context I may have said that. In general, there is a limited set of circumstances in which you get a better memory report by delay. And, in this context, what I mean by delay is usually 2 or 3 or 4 hours. Anything beyond that, I've seen no reason to ever believe that memory gets better as time goes by beyond, the initial 4 or 5 hours.
In fact, you often testify, particularly in regards to children, which many studies focus on children, about delays in memories over time, correct?
That's right.
And just to clarify, you have been given no information specific to this case, is that right?
I have seen none of the documents. I've read none of the news coverage.
Were you provided with some information from the attorneys about the case?
In a phone call this morning, and I was given sort of a thumbnail sketch of the chronology, but only that.
All right. And speaking about what defense has categorized as an extreme traumatic event, there have been studies on what's referred to as psychogenic amnesia, which can relate to retrograde amnesia and memory repression, correct?
Well, I wouldn't use the term memory repression for reasons we can go into, but certainly psychogenic amnesia can be both retrograde and anterograde. And
in particular, when looking at those studies, in and in fact, one of the articles you provided this morning, they look at certain types of trauma in particular. In particular, to look at sort of the sources of psychogenic amnesia, correct?
That's right.
And would you agree that, generally speaking, case literature on other types of trauma is often skeptical of self-reported claims of amnesia and recovery?
It's certainly true that, whenever there's a report of amnesia, one of the questions you need to ask, and often urgently need to ask, is whether the person genuinely doesn't remember or remembers perfectly well and is choosing not to talk. That's always an ambiguity to be addressed whenever you have a case that may involve amnesia.
And in the particular study, the lessons from the study of psychogenic amnesia, when they're looking at types of trauma, the study indicates that there are 6 major classes of events that have been documented as sources of psychogenic amnesia. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what Arrigo and Pestek did I think that paper was written about 20 some odd years ago, was, go looking for cases in which there was clear evidence. I mean, their argument was not that those are the things that produce amnesia, but those were the cases for which in 1997 or 8, whenever that paper was published, they were able to find what looked like clear evidence of psychogenic amnesia.
And the categories of traumas that they discussed are disasters and accidents, including specifically survivors of disasters and accidents, combat vets, attempts of suicide, criminal acts, and the experience of a violent death of a parent while you were a child, and adult rape. Those are the extreme traumas that they're referring to, correct?
Those are the categories in that article, yes.
And would you agree that research has shown in several different studies that defendants claim amnesia in 1/4 to 1/2 of homicide cases?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Research has shown that defendants claim amnesia in 1/4 to 1/2 of homicide cases.
I mean, I know that that's a common pattern. I don't at this moment remember the number of whether it's 1/4 to 1/2, but I certainly have read that that's a common pattern.
Well, that's a study from, and I'm probably going to butcher this, Good-Johnson in 1992, Koppelman in 1987, and then also a 2000 study by Bourget and Whitehurst, which states that claims of amnesia have been reported in an estimated range of 10 to 70% of homicides.
I mean, I certainly know Gisli Good-Johnson's work. I don't at this moment recall that paper, but Gisli Good-Johnson is a sensible colleague. I see no reason to challenge him.
And are you familiar with Dominique Bourget and Lori Whitehurst?
I have heard the names at this moment. I can't place them.
And would you disagree on their findings that that early studies report that 20% of offenders claiming amnesia were fabricating the memory loss? A suggestion from studies is that rate of malingering is quite a bit higher.
I mean, again, I don't recall reading that paper. I haven't looked at that paper in any detail, so I have no reason to agree with the numbers, but surely there's a number of reports out that claims of amnesia are in many cases bogus, with people lying about what they remember.
In fact, would it be fair to say that one of the main things that you want to look at is the role of motivation that a person may have? Talking about memory. Sorry, I stopped there for a second.
I mean, I'm not quite sure what are the main things you want to look at. It depends on what question you're asking, but certainly for the issue you were just pursuing of someone potentially lying about what they remember, I assume it's just a matter of common sense that lies are a deliberate act. People choose to lie. They typically choose to lie for some reason. And if you're worried that somebody's lying about what they remember, then of course you want to look at their motivation.
And because there can be quite a few types of motivation, including a motivation to gain something.
That's right.
And you have previously stated in your book that motivation can play a role in fostering false memories, correct?
I mean, it plays a relatively minor role, but yes, it can play a role in fostering false memories.
And one aspect of that is that sometimes a person is motivated to lie, and the lie can then evolve into a false memory.
That sounds like something I've written. It was true when I wrote it. It's still true.
And in in addition, you state in that same book that these mental steps are, of course, the mental steps of trying to or of regaining or claiming to regain a false memory are more likely if the suggested memory is somehow attractive to the person, and so via that path, motivation can facilitate the creation of a false memory.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, as I said, motivation can play a role in false memories, and you just described, in broad outline how that happens.
And I wanted to clarify something that you talked about kind of regarding false memories on direct. If you have memory loss, if you have not encoded the memory, how long would it take to replace that memory with a false memory?
Depends on the nature of the false memory. I mean, if it's just filling out, a detail or something like that, the process can be essentially immediate. If it's a process of developing a large and elaborate false memory that bears, let's say, little resemblance to what really happened, that's a much slower process.
It would take a lot longer.
Yeah.
In other words, you wouldn't be able to immediately answer a question with an entirely new narrative because it would take longer to come up with that narrative to replace the whole.
I'm, hesitant to make that as a sweeping claim, but, most of the time that's going to be right.
And I think kind of along those lines, what you testified to is that if someone does in fact have that memory gap, or I think in other words, if the consolidation of those memories hadn't occurred, that they are going to say things like, as best I can recall, I can't quite remember, but I think, things of that nature. Is that what you were saying?
I mean, often people are aware that they've got gaps in their memory, and then they do say those words. But often it's the opposite. Often people, without realizing it at all, are filling in gaps in their memory based on supposition and are completely convinced that they're remembering, even though the reality is that what they're giving you is an after-the-fact reconstruction.
And that's what you refer to as fiction.
I mean, to the extent that the memory is different from what actually happened, then, it can be referred to, and some people do refer to it as a memory fiction.
And you testified that, or gave an analogy of someone who's driving, and I think probably a common analogy of, you're driving your regular routine, you sort of, you remember getting in the car, you remember starting to drive, and then you kind of forget what exit you passed as you go, and you're like, whoa, how did I end up here?
Right.
You're driving though, correct?
I mean, I'm not quite sure. I mean, you certainly, realize you must have been driving. You don't think you were transported 30 miles down I-5 by space aliens. So, I mean, whether you know you're driving, whether you infer you're driving, I'm not sure what are the right words to use here.
Sure, and you're referring to the piece of the driving that you have forgotten. But in other words, you remember getting into the car, then you just get on what some people refer to, and maybe isn't scientifically correct, as autopilot. And then you drive into your driveway, and you realize you're driving into your driveway, and you're like, whoa, I just forgot. I just don't remember that drive.
That's right. I mean, the part of the event you're not going to remember is the part of the event for which you were firmly focused on something else. And if you were firmly focused on something else before you got into the car, then it's entirely possible you might not even remember getting into the car, and you might end up saying, I guess I must have, because here I am behind the wheel. But if you were focused on something else prior to even leaving your front door, you might have no recollection of getting into the car.
And would you agree that the majority of research, when talking particularly about stressful situations and trauma, would suggest that your brain shifts into a minimal encoding mode, which leads to inaccurate or incomplete recall of the following events of a stressful trauma, like the things that would follow?
I mean, I guess what we need to do is to divide things. I mean, for high levels of stress, you're not going to get retrograde amnesia. You're going to get a real sharp narrowing of memory. So you only remember the core and little beyond, but you still get anterograde amnesia, which is often described as minimal encoding mode for events subsequent. That's the very common pattern. That's very different from what you get at the extreme levels of stress, because then you're much more likely to get retrograde amnesia than anterograde amnesia.
And in sort of several studies or many discussions of that last point, is one of the common examples someone who gets into a horrific car accident and then has no memory of the actual accident itself?
I mean, yes, it is a common example, and if I can explain, I mean, for reasons of obvious research ethics, nobody is going to put somebody through some hideous event as part of an experiment. That would be ethically disgusting. And so what researchers have been doing for years is, capitalizing on the horrible fact that terrible things do happen in the world, and researchers are then able to swoop in and look at what happens when somebody, God help us, has been the victim of a rape, or when somebody has been on the scene during a murder, or anything along those lines. And so yes, one of the common lines of research is looking at car crashes, just because those do happen with sad regularity. And so, I mean, it's sad to say, it's an opportunity for researchers to find out how that kind of event is remembered.
And you mentioned one of the other, I think, examples that is often studied are people who witness or perhaps are engaged in life-saving efforts during a homicide.
And certainly those have been studied as well.
And also soldiers in combat as a common one.
Those have been less often studied, mostly because the research is just not there on the scene. It's hard to gather the data, but yes, has been commonly studied.
Just 1 second.
Sure.
And Dr. Eastberg, and perhaps this is not an area in which you have done a lot of study or research, but would you agree, and please tell me if that's the case, would you agree that there is a difference between learning about an event and witnessing it?
I mean, certainly there has been a variety of studies of, essentially secondhand memories, and with that terminology often applied to exactly, I didn't witness the Space Shuttle Challenger blowing up, but I heard about it. There has been a lot of studies of that sort, and yes, the level of trauma tends to be somewhat lower if you didn't directly witness the horrible event, and the content of what you remember tends to be focused on the experience of learning about the event rather than the event itself.
Thank you very much. That's all the questions I have.
All right, redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. So Dr. Riesberg, let's start with that last set of questions. The difference in what's known about the difference in a response to trauma from witnessing the event or experiencing it. Would it be important in studying that to focus on the long-term impact to the person, separate and apart from the experience, the witnessing experience? And what I'm asking is, if you witness an event and it's a horrible, horrible thing that's happened to somebody, but it is not somebody that you know well, would the trauma be different in kind and different in magnitude potentially from witnessing that same exact event, but occurring to somebody who is your spouse or your parent or your child, somebody who's absolutely central to your life?
Okay, let me see if I can answer, and stop me if this is not helpful for you at all. The research I'm thinking of is research done by my Danish colleague Steen Larsen some years back, and what Larsen was looking at was people who had heard about events that were enormously newsworthy, but did not affect them personally. And for those events, people were quite upset, but they certainly were not, to put it in concrete terms, traumatized to the level that might, for example, trigger retrograde amnesia. Those are events that, are really, really bad, but they're happening to somebody else. When you're talking about events that are so horrible that they're going to, disrupt or maybe even destroy the rest of your life, at that point, what matters is not did you witness it directly or did you hear about it? What matters instead is basically the level of trauma and whether the level of trauma is high enough to trigger activation of the HPA system, which is the bodily system that is in control here, in order to produce retrograde amnesia. So what really matters, for purposes of enhanced memory for the core versus no memory at all because of retrograde amnesia, for that purpose, what matters is the level of trauma, not I witnessed it directly versus I heard about it.
All right. Now, you were asked a number of questions also about what I'll refer to as the malingering, people claiming memory
And that certainly produces a form of anterograde amnesia, often for minutes or maybe a couple of hours after the precipitating event. Very different from retrograde amnesia, which, first of all, is backwards in time and can span many, many hours.
All right. And you have already indicated that with retrograde amnesia, that memory is just not going to come back. It may be partial. There may be these islands that have formed, but it's not as if 5 days later somebody's just going to wake up and say, "Oh gosh, it's all come back to me."
I mean, let's be clear, there's a bunch of mythology about this point. And if I may say so, a lot of that mythology shows up in law enforcement circles. But when you look at the evidence, if there is disrupted consolidation, nothing is recorded in memory. And therefore, you can wait 1 day, 5 days, or 5 months. That memory is not coming back because there's nothing to come back.
And if the memory loss is the prospective, is that equally true?
I mean, for purposes of minimal encoding mode, let's unpack those words. Minimal encoding means you're not taking it in, you're not absorbing it. And again, if you didn't absorb it, if it didn't go in, then later on, there is no record. If you don't put money into a bank, you can't make a withdrawal later on. If you don't put water into a bottle, you're not going to be able to drink out of it later on. That's just the way it works. If there was no input process, and for minimal encoding, you simply were not paying attention. For the example of driving down I-5 and sort of zoning out, as we say, the information never got recorded. Those are cases in which that memory is not coming back because there's nothing to come back. And likewise, if you did absorb the information, but the consolidation process was thrown off, again, the memories never reached permanent form, they never reached enduring form, and so there's no prospect of the memory coming back.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Riesberg. No further questions.
All right, Dr. Riesberg, you can disconnect. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning to you all.
All right, and we'll send the jury to lunch at this point and have them come back at 1:30. I do want a moment with the attorneys before they leave, but we'll take our lunch break. Yes. All right, please be seated. I just wanted to ask, so I guess two things. Do we think 15 minutes will be enough time to go through the exhibits and offer, admit, or object? First question, do we think that can be done in 15 minutes?
Yes, Your Honor, I take it that's directed to us. We did, as I indicated earlier, review these last night and communicate about them. And I think, just counting up, we've got 4, 5, 6, 7. I think we've only got 7 about which we have a potential disagreement as to whether foundation's been laid or there's relevance. So I wouldn't expect that to take more than 15 minutes. There are, of course, just a number of numbers to read off.
Sure.
To make sure that the record's complete,
But since you're saying potential on 6 or 7, it allows for the possibility that maybe there isn't if the two sides discuss it, unless the state knows right now that, yes, it's going to be objected to.
we do.
Then I guess what my preference would be is why don't we go through the various exhibits now? We'll take our lunch a little later, but come back at 1:30. If we come back at 1:30, Mr. Overstreet, do you think that's sufficient time for your 2 witnesses that have to testify today?
I mean, I don't know if the defense is even done with their case.
Well, I guess that's true. We don't know about the one witness and what the defense position is on the one witness who was subpoenaed but apparently didn't show up.
Your Honor, I think we've made a decision that we are not going to ask the court to hold him in contempt.
Okay. And then other than going through the exhibits, is there anything more that defense would be putting on?
No, saying there's one other thing we're supposed to do, and I would ask the court to allow us to reserve a motion until, if we rest after the exhibits, allow us to reserve a motion, whatever the second judgment of acquittal motion is. I don't remember what it's called.
Didn't defense already make a
But
motion?
I think we're supposed to make one at the close of our, maybe we just wait until the close. I think that we have to make it at the close of the defense case. I'm sounding like an idiot, aren't I?
No, it's all right.
At the close of their rebuttal or at the close of the sur rebuttal, but maybe we just wait till the very end. I just don't want to miss what.
Sure, I understand. Okay, I won't rule out at least that possibility. So let me ask, I'm going to ask this question as to defense, sort of two options. We can go through the exhibits right now and then come back at 1:30, or we can come back at 1:15 and go through the exhibits. Whatever you think will be more orderly. I just want to try to use about 15 minutes to get it done so we don't cut into the jury's time.
You might as well do it now.
Okay, all right.
Do
And
you mind if I say it while we're speaking?
no, I don't mind at all, and I would assume that, and I apologize, I think it's Mr. Breton, if I have the name right. But, I'm not going to have these exhibits memorized, so to the extent I can see what they are for the ones that are being argued about, that will be helpful.
Sure.
So, Your Honor, should I just read through the list?
Why don't we go through the
numerically?
ones that there's agreement on and deal with those first?
Okay, so there are a number that have already been admitted. There's a roll-off declaration authenticating the computer creation date of 203. 203 was pre-admitted, but 2032 is that declaration, and he testified to that. I don't think we have any disagreement about that. I was a little confused about the numbering of 208.3. That was used in opening. It's part of that Dan Nancy text thread, and it's about the point to get Nancy Brophy back onto the deed for the house. And that, at least as it was presented in opening, was two separate slides because it's a fairly long text exchange. So we've got that down as 208.3 and 208.32 because it's actually two different pages. I think probably the easier thing would be if we just made that into a single two-page exhibit
Okay,
rather than keeping that separated.
so just call it 208.3, two-page document?
Yes, and does the court have the 208.1 and 208.2 and 208.4 also? I think those are already broken out and admitted.
I have 208.3 as admitted. I have 208.1 as admitted. I have 208.2 as admitted and 208.4 as admitted.
All right, I think the only problem then is that I need to make 208.3 into a single document rather than the two that we have in right now.
All right.
Okay, and then not admitted yet, but in agreement is 212.4. That was presented to Ms. Brophy yesterday. That's from the same text exchange between the couple, but that is the March 4th, 2018 one about attacking Susan's room with reckless abandon. And we agreed, I think, that be admitted, but I'm not sure it was actually offered and admitted.
All right, and well, to be clear, I think the state had objected to it and I had overruled their objection, but
Okay,
it will be admitted.
Which number was that, Judge?
212.4,
correct.
I think that's the one you might have asked me about.
212.4. Got it. Okay. Oh, yeah, that one was, I think. Okay, got it.
And then also, we're in agreement about 214, 215, 216. Am I going too fast?
Is she going too fast?
I mean, are we, I don't know what's happening. We just said
We
two,
were talking about ones that
as long as we're
214,
agreeing that they're all admitted, that's fine. I just,
215, 216,
217,
okay,
221,
221,
222.
222.
And then we get to the first series about which we don't have agreement,
All right,
220.
well, let's first do those ones then. So the state agrees that 214, 215, 216, 217, 221, and 222, there's no objection to their admission?
Correct.
All right, so those will be admitted.
And then, do you want to reserve the ones about which there's, to which we're anticipating an objection and come back to those?
Oh, well, I mean, if you're, I thought the
Okay.
state had indicated they are objecting and they don't think there's much to talk about, so why don't we just go through them now?
Okay, so the next series, the one that we have not reached an agreement about are 224, 225, 226, and 227. Mr. Breton, can you actually put those up so the court can?
Yeah, and let's just do one at a time. So let's
Familiar.
do 224. Okay.
And so both Mr. Jaramillo and I believe Detective Broughton uh, referenced these and acknowledged what they were. Detective Broughton was had to see the bleachers at Lincoln to orient himself to the fact that that is the old police evidence building. It did eventually come around, but Mr. Jaramillo, who worked in that building for years, along with Mr. Hartvet, recognized that and identified. We went through all four of those, I believe, with him and with Detective Broughton. So I think that the foundation is laid. That building, of course, is right across the street from OCI. So those cameras are, there are multiple cameras that are shown in these exhibits, but they're pointed in the either at the building or very, very close to the building in the vicinity of that large bay door that was open at OCI. So we believe that they're both relevant and that the foundation has been laid.
All right. And what is the state's objection on that?
Well, Your Honor, there's been no foundation laid as to who took these photographs or when they were taken. They were shown to Detective Broughton, who testified that he was not sure when or if those cameras were in place at the time, which are specifically indicated and circled. He acknowledged and testified that he recognized the area. These photographs were not shown to Mr. Jaramillo. They were shown to Mr. Hartvet, and he said it looked like the building, but he was not sure if those cameras were there. He could not confirm, but he thought probably they were at the time. That's the only testimony to the four, and I know we're just talking about 224, but the objection is the same for 225, 226,
Okay,
and 227.
all right. So here's what I'll do. As you all know, I've taken fairly extensive notes. I don't remember myself what Detective Broughton or Mr. Jaramillo or Mr. Harvett said about these particular exhibits right now, but I will check my notes and I can give you a ruling on that when we come back from lunch.
Okay. So then we've got more that we're in agreement about. 228, 229, 231.1 is already admitted. 231.2, 231.3, and 232.1 we're in agreement about.
I'm sorry, the last one was 232.1?
Yes, those are all from the Affinity video. There were just two different videos.
All right.
And we've changed the description of the videos because the state had some concerns that they were unduly argumentative. So we have 231.2 now as man following other man rather than man gaining on pedestrian.
Okay.
And then 231.3 we had labeled for our own purposes as lookout. We now got that labeled as man pacing.
Okay.
And 232.1 now is just man behind wall. And I think before there was a much longer description of a man hiding behind a wall when he heard sirens.
Okay.
What was the name? I'm sorry.
Man
Man-
behind wall.
Yeah.
Is that correct, Ms. Herman?
That's correct, and that's fine.
Okay, so 228, 229, 23.1 will be admitted. 231.2 will be admitted with the new referral of it is, and I just so I understand, man following other man, is this something that appears on the exhibit itself, or it's just the way the sides were referring to it?
I think they're wondering whether we're going to be putting an exhibit list in with the book of
Oh, I
exhibits
see.
that goes
Okay,
to the
so
jury.
I get it. It'll be referred to as man following other man. Then 231.3 will be referred to as man pacing, and 232.1 will be referred to as man behind wall. And before we move on, just a quick question on this 224, 225, 226, 227. I think I remember that Detective Broughton was a state's witness. Is that right?
Yes.
But I don't actually remember from Mr. Jaramillo and Mr. Harvett. It's just going to help me find it in my notes more easily. I can't remember if they were in the state's case or in the defense case.
Our case, Your Honor, both of
Okay.
them. And they were back to back. If you find one, you'll have the other.
Okay, perfect, perfect. All right, let's continue then.
Next we have, and we've got another, probably about 6 that we're in agreement about. 233, 234, 235, 236, 237, and 237.1.
Okay. State agree that all of those are acceptable?
Yes.
Those will all be admitted? Do you want me to repeat those?
236, 237, 237.1.
Yes.
A point of clarification, Judge. I have a 231 and a 232 that are separate from the 230,
Mhm.
and those are not.
We're not offering those. Those are the,
Okay, I just wanted to
that's
make sure.
like the
Understood.
expanse of the affinity video, so we just pulled out excerpts that were more helpful.
Okay. So what,
241, we do not have an agreement about. That is a photo that was taken by the criminalists, the photographers at the scene that day. It's a photo of the bench seat of Dan Brophy's pickup truck, and it shows a book that he had
Well,
out on the bench seat next to
okay,
him.
book on the bench seat.
And we asked, Ms. Maxfield asked Detective Posey about that. Now, Your Honor, I have to admit, I have not gone back to the transcripts to check
Sure.
exactly. Obviously, I was mistaken about the last, but we believe that Detective Posey did say, yes, this was sitting on the bench seat of his truck. And then I think that Ms. Maxfield actually then went on to ask Nathaniel Stillwater a question about this, but I'm not positive that that's true.
Okay, and what's the state's objection?
Your Honor, the state's objection is relevance. We agree the foundation was laid. It was actually Detective Posey who took this photo, and he testified to that. But the line of questioning then that ensued, which led to an objection, which led to, I believe, a sustained objection, was questions about this book and some notes on another piece of paper with the suggestion and argument that this particular book was indicative of a mindset of Mr. Brophy. Mr. Stillwater was not questioned in our memory about this at all. And so certainly if the purpose of this is simply to show that there was a book in his car, I think the foundation has been laid for that, but our concern is that there is no, what is the relevance of this book? And certainly it can't be introduced for the argument or discussion about an entire mindset, as there's been absolutely no testimony to that other than simply the picture of this book.
And what is the relevance of the book?
Your Honor, whether or not he was questioned directly about this photograph, and I don't have a clear recollection of that now, perhaps the court's notes are better than my memory. Mr. Brophy's son did testify about Mr. Brophy having an interest in Michael Pollan. I think he talked about the two of them going to some sort of seminar or retreat together, either in Southern Oregon or Northern California.
Is Mr. Pollan the one that was talked about as being on the Netflix documentary?
I
Or
believe
not?
they're two different individuals, but they're both doing work in the field of psychedelics and specifically psilocybin mushrooms. So there's just been some testimony about that being something that was of current interest to Mr. Brophy. And I think as the jury is trying to sort through these difficult questions about what was going on in his life and sort of his state overall, the fact that this is the book that's out on the bench seat of his truck that he's reading at the time, we think is relevant, and the jury should be allowed to make of that what they will.
But what is the, when we talk about relevance, it's evidence that tends to show the existence of a fact more or less likely. What is the fact that we're trying to make the existence of more or less likely?
But it provides some indication, and clearly we don't have the benefit of talking with Mr. Brophy about what was going on, why he was reading this book. But between the fact that he went to the seminar and he's reading this book, it provides some indication that he is in a very constructive way working through some issues. I mean, the title of the book is How to Change Your Mind and how to use psychedelics in a, what I take to be a therapeutic way to work constructively to move forward. And I think that could be something that the jury finds helpful in trying to understand and work through this very different set of perspectives that the parties are presenting about Dan Brophy, who he was and what was going on with him at that period in time.
Okay. Any other exhibits to talk about?
There are a number that we're in agreement about. I think the only other one that we're not, there are two more that we're not in agreement about. You want me to skip ahead to those?
Sure.
Okay. 299 is the photo of Jessie Smith in the B suit. We believe that was shown to Jessie Smith, and she identified that earlier, and I'm not sure exactly what the state's objection is. That she's testified that she was out working with Dan Brophy in the garden, and that she was the one who was supposed to spray, and she was somewhat self-deprecating about her abilities as the bee assistant. But
okay, state's objection.
The photo was never shown to the jury or to the witness.
I will say, funny how memory is. I don't remember this photograph. I feel like there was a photograph shown, but not this one. But I'm not entirely sure any photograph was shown. But I will look at Jessie Smith's testimony and see what I put.
And that's not critical to our case. I think actually it was just a sweet story.
I think
about
probably
Dan
not,
Brophy.
but sure. I'm not trying to deny you the opportunity to put in anything.
And then the last one is 307, and that Josiah Roloff authenticated that. That was a voicemail that was left on Dan Brophy's phone, but it was left by a client who was trying to reach Nancy Brophy, and it came in the context of that discussion about the fact that shared Apple ID had caused communications to go either to both of them or to the wrong one, that there was a period in which there was a confusion of the data on their respective iPhones, and that was what we offered up as an example of what was happening, and that ends up on Dan Brophy's phone, and then he responds to his wife by saying, "Can you please straighten this out?" I'm paraphrasing, but essentially, gosh, can we get this straightened out? This woman, I just had a conversation with an older woman client of yours that should have gone to your phone. And the reason that we think that is relevant, the reason that we had Mr. Roloff authenticate that was on Dan Brophy's phone, is that there, in many respects, only a person who was a terrible, terrible, terrible planner would commit the acts in the manner that the state suggests that Ms. Brophy did. One would think that there are many examples that we could give, but having your phone data intertwined with your husband's and unpredictably going to him would mean that you had randomly had a complete lack of privacy with respect to the business that you were conducting on your own phone. So we do think it's relevant that was the status at the time of Mr. Brophy's death.
And this was Exhibit 307, I think?
It was.
Okay, and state's objection to this one?
Well, Your Honor, although Mr. Roloff testified it was found on the phone, there's been literally no other evidence introduced about this. I don't know that she didn't call the wrong phone number thinking it was Nancy's phone. That whole discussion that Ms. Weinmiller just went on and on about the exchange between Nancy and Dan is not in evidence. It was not offered. I don't know. We don't have any information about who Carol is, other than that she was trying to reach Nancy, and the content of the voicemail, which is hearsay. Although I guess sort of understand the relevance argument, and at the end there, I don't think there is any relevance to the fact at issue here. If someone called a phone number, which there was no evidence on what number was called, and left a voicemail, and it got to a different phone.
And so just as a reminder to me, was this voicemail played to the jury previously?
It was played.
Okay. And can I hear it? How long is it?
Short. It's pretty short.
Can I just hear it one more time?
Nancy, it's Carol Stewart, and my phone number is 503-844.
I remember it. All right. Thanks. Since I'm already giving rulings on everything else, when we come back, I'll give a ruling on this one too when we come back. And those were the last two in dispute.
There's actually one more, and I apologize. It looks like we left it off our email to defense, but the last one in dispute is 382.
382. And what is that?
It's an academic article that Karen Lawless testified about. It's the San Diego.
Oh, the San Diego Police Department. Okay, all right. What is since you didn't have a chance to say what the basis of the objection was, go ahead.
Well, I think it's hearsay, Your Honor, and it's not relevant. I mean, it's one study of numerous different studies. I don't think she certainly testified about it, and they heard all of that testimony, and she and Mr. Overstreet went back and forth in depth on sort of the nature of that study and the reliability or unreliability of that particular study, and the difference between, and she testified herself that the methods used in this particular study were not all in effect at the state crime lab here in Oregon, particularly the soaking method, nor did she have any direct knowledge on exactly how the state crime lab was even currently or then testing DNA casings or casings for DNA in any particular manner. And so I think it's misleading and confusing to the jury.
All right, so there was objections based on relevancy, hearsay, and even if it isn't hearsay, 403 balancing. Ms. Weinmiller, I would just ask you to address the hearsay and balancing portions of the argument.
And Your Honor, I think, do you want to address that? Your Honor, there was testimony about it. I think it's helpful to the jury to be able to see the support behind it. I mean, scientific studies are routinely allowed in. I don't think that they are subject to the same level of scrutiny that other hearsay would be, and I don't see how that is problematic. That's an article that was reviewed by the person who is, I can't remember her title now, but she's, no, I know, I remember her name. I'm trying to remember her title. Marla Kaplan, who holds a distinguished position within the DNA unit at the Oregon State Police. So she's somebody who had reviewed this article and signed off on it, and it seems to me that that is, we don't have an article that was published by OSP. I think the state at one point was considering bringing in somebody from OSP to address this, but we think that the article does give good current information about the state of the science, and it would be helpful to the jury to read this in conjunction with having heard Karen Lawless's testimony.
Okay. And were there any more exhibits that the sides do not agree upon?
I don't believe so.
All right, and we're rapidly running out of our lunch hour. Were there more exhibits that the sides do agree on that you wanted to put on the record?
Yes, Your
Okay.
Honor. We stopped at, right, okay, it is a long list, and I apologize for this. Ms. Liu, tell me if I'm talking too fast, okay? 245.1,
And I'll repeat everything you say. 245.1,
245.2,
245.2,
246,
246,
247,
247,
250,
250,
251,
251,
252,
252,
255,
55,
256,
256,
258,
258,
259,
259,
260 and 261, 260.1 are both already admitted.
so 260 and 261.
Well, I said that poorly. 260 and 260.1 are already admitted.
260 and 260.1, okay.
We're moving to admit 261,
261,
262,
262,
263,
263,
264,
264,
265,
265,
268.
268. Did you get all those?
Yes, I believe so.
You want me to repeat them?
No, I think I am okay.
And state agrees that, okay, so
Correct.
those will all be admitted. And then the last thing, I want to bring it up now so that defense, if they want to talk with Mr. Scott about this, they can. But I did read the two cases over the break, or I guess not break, but period. Let me just get them real quickly.
Your Honor, I'm very sorry to say that I am not done with the list.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right, okay, go ahead.
We actually have exhibits in the 400, but they're not all contiguous.
Okay, let's go ahead then.
So already admitted are 269 through 286. Those were all Tiffany Couch. And then there's a series of exhibits relating to John Lenz's testimony, 287,
287,
288,
288,
289,
289,
290,
290,
291,
291,
291.1,
91.1,
292,
292,
293,
293,
294,
294,
295,
295,
296,
296,
297,
297,
298.
298.
And then we have the disputed 299, the B-suit photo.
Yep, yep.
300 we're in agreement about.
Oh. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yep.
300, all right.
301 and 302 are admitted. We're offering 304,
304,
305.
305,
The court's considering 307,
yep.
312,
312,
312.1,
312.1,
313,
313,
313.1,
313.1,
313.3,
313.3,
313.4,
313.4,
313.5,
313.5,
314,
314,
315,
315,
316,
316,
317,
370,
321,
321,
322,
322,
323,
323,
324,
324,
325,
325,
326,
326,
326.2,
326.2,
327,
327.
328,
If you need to slow down.
I'm there.
328,
329,
329,
330,
330,
331 has been admitted, 332,
332,
333,
33,
334,
334,
335,
35, 336,
337,
337,
338,
338,
339,
339,
340,
340,
341,
341,
342,
342,
343,
43,
344,
344,
345,
45,
346,
346,
359,
359,
362,
62,
363,
363,
364,
364,
getting close to the end,
okay,
365,
365,
368,
368,
369,
369,
370,
370,
371,
371,
372,
372,
373,
373,
377,
377.
no, that's been admitted. There are three in a row. 377, 378, 379 are already admitted.
Okay.
380 we're offering,
380,
381,
381,
383,
383.
and then Your Honor is considering 382.
Yep.
And I believe the rest, let me double check this. I believe the rest all relate to Ms. Jacobs. So there is a 400 series of exhibits. There, 400 through 406 were admitted. There are additional exhibits that we'll be using with her, so we have not offered them
Okay.
yet.
And those we'll hold off on.
Right.
Okay. All right. So all of it, so let me ask, up to 383, does the state agree?
Correct.
So all of the ones, even the ones that defense said were already admitted, just in case they weren't, they are admitted as well. And then the last thing before we leave, I just want to put on the record that I did, oh, Mr. Scott is here. So what I was going to say, Mr. Scott, I did read State versus Houston at, so the record reflects at 319 Oregon 583, which came out on May 18th of this year, 2022. I also read Jane versus Kane at 319 Oregon Appellate 659 came out the same day, 2022. It has not changed my mind on my earlier ruling, but I do want to give you sufficient time to make a record. It doesn't have to be right now because I want to give people time to eat lunch, but I do want to do it in a way that so you are able to be present and make your record. I doubt we're going to get to this witness today at this point, so I just wanted to give you sort of the heads up on that.
Certainly. The part of the record I do want to make now, because I didn't cite the actual evidence code provision. It is mentioned in Houston, so I'm probably covered, but I want to be certain.
Sure.
Which is Oregon Evidence Code 6091 sub 2, which talks about when a witness isn't fully forthcoming about the bias and interest that they potentially possess. One doesn't have to show they have this bias and interest, but rather that it's potential, that the defense has an opportunity to put on extrinsic evidence of that bias. Obviously, we are in a slightly handicapped from putting on such evidence, partly because of the motions to quash that were granted regarding the immense scope of Ms. Jacobs' fraudulent activities. But we do have some that we are going to want to put on extrinsic evidence for. Specifically, because we know of the number of different criminal episodes, at least, and the amount of theft, at least as implied by the Department of Justice letter, we are going to want to seek to put on an expert in sentencing law to talk about, ultimately, the scope, from what we can tell, the scope of potential exposure that Ms. Jacobs faced because of her most recent fraudulent activity. And so we are in the process of working on that now. Now, obviously, if she doesn't in any way minimize her potential exposure or what she knew about it, that if she is fully forthcoming, at least to the extent that the court allows us to inquire, then we wouldn't be able to put on such extrinsic evidence. But I believe under OEC 6091 sub 2, we would.
Okay, all right. And of course, it's always possible that things she says causes me to change my mind, but at this point, that's my ruling. All right, we'll take our lunch break. Look, I'm just gonna ask the sides, can you be back at 1:30?
Absolutely.
Okay, then let's be back at 1:30.
Okay, we'll go off record and we're in recess. All rise.